Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining in today. We're looking at, my name is Raman, and obviously I'm looking at starting the Learning Outcome 2, which is to look at continuing on our journey for the Unit 1 in the OTHM Level 3 Assessor course. So today we're going to be discussing, different methods of assessment. What are the different types of methods of assessment? And this particular learning outcome has just two assessment criteria. So first of all, we'll be looking at understanding broadly what is assessment, what are the different types of assessments, and then we'll go into details of going into the assessment criteria, which is looking at identifying assessment methods that can be used during the assessment process. That means you need to appropriately design and use a particular form of assessment which will be suitable for your learners or for your learners in terms of the study. And then the second part we are going to be looking at is comparing and contrasting some of the assessment methods which could be utilized in, obviously assessing the work which is submitted by our learners. So there's a fair bit of indicative content, and obviously there are 16 different types of assessment methods. We're going to be covering broadly 6 or 7 major types, which we get to see being implemented in higher education, specifically in vocational qualifications and in the regulated qualification framework. So they would be the focus of attention, but I would also share a handout which typically has these 16 different forms of assessment, which could be endpoint assessments. These assessments are generally, because there are different ways in which courses and qualifications can be studied. One such way, which obviously the government is looking at promoting, is through the route of apprenticeships. And in such cases, you would generally see endpoint assessment being applied, witness statements or witness observations being applied. And in some cases, you would also look at work products or portfolios being created in the case of vocational qualifications. So let's get into looking at obviously the details of discussing this particular learning outcome, which is looking at types and different types of assessments. For those of you who did not join the last session, we just a brief recap. We basically ended up covering the principles of assessment and why assessment as a route is generally applied to check the process of learning. Now, we will go into a bit of detail today to elaborate in terms of, when we look at the VASCAR model in particular, which is related to validity, reliability, consistency, authenticity, and obviously the, fairness of the assessments that you do to check knowledge and understanding of the learner for a particular topic area or a subject area. And obviously, one of the key processes of assessment tends to be that you are looking at helping the learners develop skills, knowledge, and that is where you are looking at providing feedback. And this feedback would feed into when we understand different types of assessment methods. So your picking up of or your choice of the assessment methods has to be such that you're looking at allowing, say, for example, you're picking up appropriate method, which will allow you to feedback, and that feedback will be developmental for the learner in terms of either achieving higher grades, building knowledge, problem solving skills, or in general, helping to so when we look at case studies and some of the other types of assessment, you would look at primarily learners picking up and building on what is called the cognitive skills. So when we look at the aspect of that, we are looking at the abilities wherein the learners are able to develop and use their mind and process information, and obviously then able to bring that across in the form of some sort of assessments which are done. So in today's learning outcome, understanding different types of assessment methods, we'll be looking at a number of different types of assessments, generally speaking, about 7 or 8 of them, which are commonly used, as I mentioned. But let's start off with some key terminology to understand, what are assessments, and when we do talk about assessments, why are they important from a point of view of, teaching and learning. So as I mentioned earlier in the first session, that when we do talk about assessments, what we're looking at is assessments are a way of supporting learning, essentially. If somebody is to ask you a question, what is assessment in higher education or education in general, it is a way wherein as a teacher, as a tutor, as an instructor, as a lecturer, you are going to be supporting the learning of the student, learner, or a child. Now, assessments as a process help the teachers and learners, and also to a certain extent parents, when we include primary and secondary education. It also helps them to understand and track what are the important events the child is going through or the student is going through in the process of the learning, in the process of teaching and learning. Now, assessment as a process covers lots of things. It covers things like how teachers support and obviously look at, um, you know, let's say monitoring the progress of a student or a child. And what they do is when they monitor this, they identify next steps that have to be put in place to, make learning meaningful. Now, there could be reporting part of it because the assessments at the end of the day come up and compile to some sort of reports or some sort of a, I would say, descriptive summary. So it could be used to compile reports which are shared with parents, carers, teachers, or it could be generally, which could be a way to track a progress of a student and how they are going through the teaching and learning journey. Informal education, obviously, assessments become important because they are related to child's achievement or student's achievement. And that is where, if you have a learner in higher education, obviously the process of assessments would help them achieve units and obviously, or thereby overall achieving the qualification. So there are lots of things which can be looked at from a point of view of assessment. Now, if we look at how the assessments and assessment planning is done, because this is something that we covered, in the first learning outcome, we look at first formulating, learning outcomes or intended statements, which are learning outcomes. At the qualification level, there will be key descriptors. Then we go across to selecting different assessment measures. How would or what would be the most relevant way to assess an assignment, a case study, say, for example, through an exam or a quiz or a formative or a summative assessment, different types we look at. And then what method that you choose would allow the learning to be supported. That means it helps teachers, it helps learners, and also parents in certain extent when we talk about primary education, secondary education, and it helps them understand what is the depth and breadth of learning which is being undertaken so that progress can be made in the process of teaching and learning. So this is where the idea is to create experiences. And when we look at creating experiences, what we are looking at is that these learning outcomes are leading to some sort of an outcome which will essentially help students, learners, children go through certain stages. So when they see we progress from key stage 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, then we look at discussing and using the assessments results to improve learning. So assessments are a way to, measure something at a particular point in time. If they do not meet or conform the requirements, then you give feedback. That feedback then allows the learner to change work, elaborate work, amend work. And then once it is resubmitted, reevaluated, you would see that the learner's ability to be able to gain that knowledge and skill has been fulfilled. And thereby you say that the assessment has been successful or the learner has been successful in achieving the objectives. Now, when we look at the process and the assessment, that is where we will follow this four-step cycle, and this four-step cycle would essentially be the planning of assessment, designing of assessment, not planning, designing of assessment, and relevant assessment methods that you would use to assess the work. Now, there are different methods through which we can go through and diagnose and obviously assess the learning, and this tends to be the six different types. So there are diagnostic assessments, formative assessments, summative assessments, ipsative assessments. You have norm reference assessment and criterion reference assessments. Now, we are aware of diagnostic assessments. Example here, if you have a student or a learner looking at doing a qualification, what you would essentially do is basically put across some diagnostics, and the diagnostic assessment part of it would essentially be related to, let's say, recognizing, the prior qualification or, say, for example, knowledge and experience of the learner. So these type of assessments undertaken by the teachers, tutors, instructors, educators tend to look at the strength, weakness, knowledge, and skills of prior achievements that the learners have done. And this would be a type of assessment which would allow you to, say, for example, look at testing the eligibility of a learner onto a particular level. So if somebody comes in and wants to join a level, say, 6 course, we would look at testing the ability of the learner by looking at conducting diagnostic assessments. They would take, you look at prior education, you look at prior skills, you look at the CV, you look at which is the highest qualification the learner has, and then if we do feel that the learners do not, if there's a doubt in terms of the ability of the learner, then you would put the learner through some sort of tests or diagnostics to say, can we assess whether you are able to study at that level, and that will be diagnostics. Now, when we look at formative assessments are regular informal assessments that are used by teachers to assess students and obviously give them information about how they are progressing in their teaching and learning. So formative assessment tend to be, I would say, involve a bit of monitoring and assessing students' learning and progress during the course of instructions when they are being delivered. That means during the course of teaching that is being delivered. And the aim here is to provide ongoing feedback to students. So one of the things that you have to keep in mind when you think of formative assessments, you look at ongoing feedback, which is what is provided to the learners. Now, when we look at the next one, which is summative assessment differ from formative assessments because they are used to evaluate the students' learning at the end of the instructional, in let's say the end of teaching and delivery. So in this case, what you're looking at doing is then comparing the achievement, the knowledge and skills which the learner has gained from the work that they submitted, and this generally tends to have a higher stake than formative assessment because this is where the final judgment on what the student has essentially produced or submitted is done, and it provides a conclusion to, say, for example, the element of teaching and learning, which would say that the student has achieved this unit, achieved this program, or has achieved it with this grade, and this achievement is with the following grade, essentially. So when we look at summative, it's end point assessment. That means they have done towards the end of the course, end of the unit, end of the module, and they confirm the understanding of what the learner has done or has gained as knowledge and skills, and that would be, summative assessment. Now, if summative assessments tend to evaluate individuals' performance or traits in relation to their own previous performance. That means if I want to compare my performance from today and my performance 2 years back, then this form of assessments would generally be called as ipsative assessments. Now, an example of this would be when you're looking at an individual, in this case, a learner, child, or a student progressing, when we look at comparing their current progress or performance to their previous achievements. And what we are emphasizing here is personal growth rather than external standards. So the breakdown, when we look at ipsative assessments, tend to be when we are looking at comparing our own performance with our past performance, and the focus is primarily on personal improvement. And that is where you would look at ipsative assessment. Now, these tend to also fall into what is called sometimes reflection that we do in higher education, and that would typically tend to be that what have you learned, how have you learned, and what is the process through which you've gone through to learn and develop a particular skill. Now, when we talk about norm referenced, assessments, we are looking at primarily talking about a type of assessment here, which is going to be, evaluative of the fact that at the end of it, you are going to test, for example, some sort of data, or for example, in this case, if I have to put it in a simpler way, what I would say is the norm reference assessment tend to compare individual performance to a group. So here, when sometimes we see comparisons of your performance or marks that you received or grades you have received with the performance and the marks of the overall class or overall year, that is where you would probably look at the norm reference assessment. So essentially, the focus here is on understanding how you have performed vis-a-vis the group or the class or the relevant, I would say, group which has been taken into account when we look at comparison or when we look at referencing your performance with the performance of other students or peer groups in a particular field. So an example here would be if you score, for example, 80% marks in your maths exam, and this then can be compared to how other students have fared in the maths exam. And once we come to that comparison, this method would be referenced or would be a form of norm reference assessment. So comparison between your own performance and the performance of the group, your peers, your class would be essentially norm reference assessment. Now, when we talk about criterion reference assessments or CRA, they are a process through which you're evaluating the learning of students against a predefined qualities or criteria which is set in the achievements. So here, when we look at benchmarking, criterion-based or looking at criterion-based assessments, what we are essentially looking at is we are looking at measuring the, let's say, performance of say in your case as a student, your performance when we refer it to the key descriptors or benchmarks which are defined by awarding bodies in the qualification. So this would be a means through which a teacher would create, you look at judging how the student does in an assessment task based on the standards and criteria which are primarily defined by the awarding organization, or in a bigger subset, by off call in this case. So, for example, when an assessment is set and you are doing that task, which is based on the standard and the criteria, then what we are looking at essentially is that we are looking at how you are performing with regards to the key descriptors which have been given for that qualification. So, a grading scale, for example, wherein you are going to be referring to your assessments, but as an overall, we are also looking at what is the norm. Now, example here that I would give you is when we look at the A levels and the GCSE results which come out, they compare this for the whole of the GCSEs, which have anybody who's sat GCSEs with the results of last year, and with the results which the which is basically the benchmark which off call, for example, has set, or the Department for Education has said. So, as criterion-based assessments are looking at basically, providing results in a transparent and in a consistent manner, which allows students, parents, teachers to evaluate the results across the board, with other reference benchmarks which are given. For example, ranking of universities. Now, ranking of universities is done on a criterion-based assessment because you look at job, you look at, for example, experience, student experience, you look at facilities, you look at resources, you look at obviously opportunities which students get for placement, and towards the end, career opportunities. How many students have gone to universities, and then after completion of their course, they have been successfully placed in terms of getting a job. And that criterion-based that particular assessment through which you look at creating the ranking on the basis of these parameters would essentially be an example of criterion-based reference. Now, one of any questions at this stage, please feel free to ask me. Now, one of the other things that we look at in terms of assessments that we do, a lot of us don't realize there is a subtle bit of difference between when we talk about assessments. There can be assessment of learning, there can be assessment for learning, and there can be assessment as learning. Now, there are three subtle, very different concepts that we also need to understand, because when we look at classroom-based teaching or teaching online or any form of teaching which is being delivered, there could be three different forms of assessments which could be involved: assessment of learning, for learning, as learning. Now, when we look at assessment of learning, these are usually basically going to be grade based. That means they are essentially going to be exams. They're going to be essentially, a portfolio of evidence which learners prepare. You're submitting a final project like a dissertation, and there could be standardized tests that you have to do at the end of going through the teaching and learning process. Now, these are typically graded, and here the idea is to communicate your achievement to anybody who's related to you, like parents, teachers, school authorities, and that is where this process of assessment of learning essentially would happen. Now, in these types, or when we say assessment of learning, we generally have three different types of assessment, which could be designed, or methods which could be used to design the form of assessments that students undergo. They could be summative assessment, norm reference, and criterion reference assessments. Now, when we talk about assessment for learning would essentially mean that here you are providing a very clear snapshot of what the student is understanding and learning, and how you are managing that learning within the classroom or any sort of teaching environment. So here, the assessment is going to be based on what is called ongoing and actionable results. And some of the questions which you will ask and the students would ask, and it'll come to their mind, would be, what do students need to know? So when we talk about the indicative content in the units, or what we are expected as lecturers to teach you, when we talk about qualifications or units, what do students need to know? What is the end goal and objective of that particular unit or that qualification? So when we look at our schemes of work and lesson plan, designing assessment for learning will always answer these questions, and your schema work and lesson plans would need to have this. So why do students take, what do you take away from the lesson? So towards the end, teachers summarize when we are teaching and delivering, what have we learned today? What are the key takeaway points? Did the students find the lesson too easy or too difficult? So was the delivery in terms of teaching and learning, the medium of instruction, the way it was actually delivered, what did it include theoretical concepts? Did it have examples and applications? Did the students participate? And you look at these type of things which are going to be answered, wherein what we are looking at is understanding assessment for learning. That means, is it creating learning at the student's end? Is it leading to some sort of learning at the student's end? And that would essentially be the assessment for learning. Now, common types here tend to be formative and diagnostic assessments. The third one that we are looking at is assessment as learning. Now, here the assessment as learning involves participation of students, active participation of students in the learning process. This is going to be focused on helping the student learn, problem solving skills, critical cognitive, skills, and they would then be what do you call attributed to a certain set of goals that they need to achieve, and this progress is going to be measured to see if they are going to achieve that particular goal or not. Now, in some cases, these type of assessments tend to be, looking at individual performance and comparing their performance with past performances that they have done. So when you look at athletes, when they run, say, 100 meters, if they've run 100 meter in 12 seconds, 14 seconds, then the next time when they participate in a competition, their previous performance would be considered to the current performance. And that is where the ipsative assessments come in. Self-assessments and peer assessments also come in, is because you are looking at benchmarking your own goals and own, progress against certain of these objectives, because you're focused on personal growth and personal progress. And that is why these sort of assessments tend to be focusing on assessment as learning, that you're trying to improve. So if I'm able to say, for example, again, sticking to that example, if I'm able to walk a mile in, say, 10 minutes, and if I'm looking at reaching a goal, then my assessment as learning would be that, okay, my goal which has been set is I want to walk a mile in 8 minutes, but I'm currently at 10 minutes. So how do I improve that time of, or how do I, decrease that time to 8 minutes? And the steps and activities that you put in to undertake that would be taken as assessment for learning, because this is for your personal growth. And what you're looking at is improving your own criterias when you set achievable goals for yourself. So any questions on this? Feel free to ask me questions if you have any during the course of our discussion, even through the chat room. Now, broadly understanding the different types of assessments that are required, which is the aim of this particular learning outcome. We are looking at different types, and there could be 16 different types, as I mentioned. They fall into different types of assessment methods, as we've discussed, which are 6 different types: diagnostic, formative, summative, ipsative, criterion reference, and norm reference. Now, when we look at different types of assessment methods, we are going to be talking in terms of the different methods that we apply for assessment. So they could be formative assessment, which are ongoing. You could have quizzes and tests. You have assignments and homework, case studies, class discussions, peer assessments. You have self-assessment, and sometimes you have reflective statements that you also do, which is primarily to, look at how your learning, has shaped up, or what has been your experience of learning, and you write a reflective statement on that. Now, when we talk about different types of summative assessments, they tend to be examination, final projects, portfolios, presentations, and standardized test or capstone projects. Now, capstone projects are projects which basically involve experiences that students would need to go through. They would then synthesize that information and then apply their experience in a comprehensive manner to basically further, their studies. These projects obviously involve research, practical application, and presentation components. So when you look at doing a PhD, for example, or for example, you were asked to undertake a life-changing, say you were asked to undertake, say, for example, a mountaineering, mountain climbing experience. Now, those bits would give you, if I undertake and go across and take that particular experience. I will be learning at, say, my fear of heights would disappear, or probably I'll get to comprehend my fear of heights. I will look at how do you look at adrenaline rush? How, for example, what is how do you balance, and how do you work in a team if you're doing it as a group? And then there are other aspects of adventure, and lots of adrenaline rush, enthusiasm, things like that, that you will be taking into account. Now, when you come back, you might be asked to apply that to team working. You might be asked to apply that to a project or a project launch, which you are expected to do along with some of the other team members. And that is why you were sent away on that particular trip, to basically work together, understand each other, and then work as a coordinated unit. So in such cases, that would be an example of capstone projects. Now, what we need to look at is, when we talk about formative and summative assessments, we need to look at different types, and when they are used, how they are used, and why they are used to test the ability of students or learners in terms of their knowledge and skills. So there could be two different broadly classifications, formative and summative, and that is what I've put together as a table here. So you need to have a good understanding of what are formative and what are summative types of assessment, and if they have to be applied, then when we mention, okay, we're going to have a test or a quiz, you clearly know that this is a formative assessment. When you say there's an exam, you clearly understand that this is a summative form of assessment. Now, what I would suggest is go through these to understand briefly, because I've just explained them in a couple of words in terms of what they mean and using an example. Now, some of part of this we are also going to be discussing in task criteria 2.1. That's why I would take this up in a bit more detail, rather than going through in the overarching, explanation of the learning outcome. Now, the first assessment criteria talks about, obviously discussing, identify assessment methods that could be used during the assessment process. Now, because we are doing an assessor course, and we are not looking at a generic situation, we're looking at a situation wherein you're in either further or higher education. And here the idea would be to identify the assessment processes which are going to be tailored to evaluating students' performance, and understanding from a point of view of context is education. So these processes could either be formative or summative, and they would help us in, obviously, assessing the student's ability to be able to comprehend and understand any sort of work which has been given. And at some stage, if it is formative, it is going to obviously allow you to give feedback to the learner. But if it is summative, this would mean that you would probably have the ability to also then assign grades, or some sort of I would say, apply some sort of final, judgment to how the students have actually performed in that type of, task which has been set. So we will look at summative and, formative assessments. And this particular table that I've got here, basically helps you clearly identify the different types. And this would be a bit of a summary, when we look at discussing this particular task or the assessment criteria 2.1. So generally speaking, when we look at different types of assessment methods, and we talk in terms of what they are used for, what would be the appropriate stage at which they are used for, you would be looking at these different types: quizzes, assignments, class discussions, peer self-assessment, reflective statements, examination, final projects, portfolios, presentations, standardized tests. For example, when people sit GCSE or A-level exams, or you sit an exam for functional skills. And obviously, when you go into doing research or dissertation, which involves live working of projects, for example, you do an intern placement, you do apprenticeships, you essentially look at a summer, let's say, placement in an organization to complete a part of your course, then they would be capstone form of projects or assessment. Now, what I've done obviously in this case is, this is a bit theoretical. You need to understand where they need to be applied, and how you need to design these assessments which are appropriate for the learner who's undergoing a process of teaching and learning. So when we talk about quizzes and tests, just as an example, this is formative assessment. This would be short. The frequency of these assessments could be quite frequent. That means generally when we are teaching in the school and you're teaching in a particular term, you would have students undergoing different form of assessments, like they'll undergo some sort of quizzes, or they'll undertake some sort of short tests at the end of every 4 weeks. That is to test their knowledge in learning and how it is happening. And then this would allow teachers to put a corrective action plan or an individual learning plan in place to help the students improve their if they are lacking in a particular area, then it will help students to identify teachers to identify those gaps, and then put activities in place which will help the student gain that minimum requirement knowledge and learning which is required at that particular stage. So they tend to be activities wherein these would be primarily conducted at shorter frequencies. They would essentially be formal types of assessments, formative type of assessments. They would allow students to teachers to help monitor their progress in terms of their students, and they could be a number of such tests and activities which could be performed in a particular term. Then you look at assignments and homework. They could be formative type, wherein learners are asked to do a piece of work or create, an assignment, submit an assignment on which they will get feedback. And these could be related to classroom activities, which sometimes in homework, which is given to learners to say, can you read this particular article and summarize what are the key salient points which are being, key findings which have been presented in that article, and that could be a form of assessment. So these typically tend to be done, again on a formative basis. Students have the ability to get feedback, which will allow them to understand the patterns of test or how their achievements are going to be tested when they receive summative assessment. Classroom discussions tend to be again formative. This is to involve dialogue among students. This is to involve them to start thinking creatively, discuss, work together as teams to look at essentially achieving a goal or an objective. This encourages participation and obviously critical thinking. You have formative type of peer assessment, which typically tends to evaluate each other's work. Sometimes you would see in the class, you've been given a test, and what the teachers would do is say, exchange your notes and give it to the partner sitting next to you, and then you mark each other's questions or answers that you have provided. So this would, and then the idea over here would be that you would also need to give out an example of why this has not been achieved, and in such cases, it leads to the development of critical, thinking skills. Self-assessments tend to be looking at your own piece of work. Sometimes you look at checklists. Sometimes you look at rubrics structures which are defined in assignments. And in such cases, what you're looking at is asking the students to reflect on their own learning progress, and that would be helping to identify how you're moving ahead in your personal goals that have been set. Similarly, you have reflective writing, you have examinations, and portfolios, standard assessments. Some of them are summative. So in this case, when you sit an assignment, when you're given an assignment, you'd primarily be looking at for example, looking at giving that particular, let's say when you submit the assignment, then you are graded on that assignment. Sometimes assignments can be a combination of presentations. You have to, make presentations in front of in front of other students or colleagues, and that would allow the summative assessments to be completed. So that would allow and cover the identification of assessment methods during the assessment process in detail, which is the first assessment criteria. The second assessment criteria talks about comparing and contrasting the different methods when you're dealing with learners. So why do we need to design and pick the right assessment methods? Simply because that is to keep it in mind that when you're looking at school, say for example, primary education, it is more of a continuous process of monitoring and development of portfolio. Towards the end of it, parents would be called, and obviously look at how your child's handwriting, for example, has improved over the weeks and months, and that would be seen when you look at auditing the work in terms of the writing notepad, which is writing sessions or classes which the students attend. When you look at secondary school, they tend to be, combination of discussions, short activities, and in some cases, culminate at the end towards having tests and papers or some sort of class tests and papers. When you look at further education, it tends to be in the form of, again, assignments, and in some cases, you know, in the form of presentations or observation records, and they would then come across, for example, when we look at gym, for example, and if you are a gym instructor and you have a number of students there, then in such cases, what you are generally going to see is that you are going to help evaluate the results of why the student has met the stage one, or let's say a stage two of understanding how to work with weights, would be by asking them to carry out practical exercises which will be observed. And in those cases, you would generally then concur and say that, okay, yes, this has been achieved. The bit in higher education would be in the form of assignments. Sometimes it could be in the form of witness statements. It could be in the form of observations. It could be in the form of, tasks which are set, and in some cases, even time-controlled exams in the case of law, or, for example, some of the other qualifications wherein there's a minimum component of the assignment or the work wherein you need to sit and timed exam and go through them. And they would be the routes through which you look at doing assessments. So the task here is essentially to compare and contrast the different assessment methods. And how you would go about contrasting and comparing the different assessment methods would be to look at where they are applied, how they are applied, and when the application is looked at, how does it help the students, the teachers, in some cases the parents, to look at confirming that the achievement that they have done is meeting the expectation and the criteria. So in this case, what we are looking at is understanding what are the different types of assessments, what are their advantages, what are their limitations, and this advantages and limitations or disadvantages or advantages comparison would help you to understand what would be the different methods used, and when they are required to be used in terms of putting or checking your learners' achievement. So some part of this I've explained briefly in the slides. By summary of this is on the table that you see on the screen, and then what I've also done is explained the comparison by looking at comparing two different forms like assignment and quizzes, observation reports, and group discussions. I've looked at witness statements with multiple choice questions, and in some cases MCQs or multiple choice questions with short questions, and then looked at why they are suitable for assessment when we choose them at a particular level, whether it's school, primary school, secondary school, FE, or HE. And this comparison would help you understand the process of, contrasting assessment methods, which can be used primarily for the purposes of checking your learners' ability in terms of teaching and learning, and obviously what you have taught. Has that been understood? Has that been understood? And then grading and obviously providing judgments to say that the student work meets this particular criteria, and that would be um, that would be essentially the bit which is required. So this helps us, come to an end for further, I would say, discussion on, the second learning assessment, which is primarily focused on, I would say, understanding the different types of assessment methods. Now, what I would suggest is, for some additional reading, I would essentially ask you to look at reading one or two articles which are on the website. And these typically are going to be useful because they will, I would say, give you a bit more knowledge and understanding on what we have discussed today in this particular, learning outcome in the lecture today. And these are additional articles would also give you some, additional information, which is where how they are applied in different contexts. For example, when we look at university assignments, or when we look at different forms of assessment, norm oblique criterion weights, formative oblique summative assessments, and in general they would give you a bit more information about why these different forms of assessments are considered, and how you at some stage would take them into practice or put them into practice, depending on the sector or field that you are teaching or assessing in. So I hope you have found this session to be useful. And what we're going to do is meet up next week to cover Learning Outcome 3. Until then, my session will be to read the slides and also one or two handouts which I'm going to put, which are basically talking of 16 different forms of assessment essentially, and that would essentially be useful in order to get a fuller grasp on this particular learning outcome. So thank you so much for attending, and I will see you next week.